Welcome back, everyone. My name is Catherine Rehe-Mackey. I'm Associate Director of the Council on Science and Technology, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next panel, the second of three panels today, on how data and evidence are presented and communicated. These are, of course, such critical topics in this time of so-called fake news and when there are these reflective tendencies to turn each issue into both sides back and forth, no matter how strong the evidence is on only one side of the issue. And I'm looking at you, climate journalists. The chairs for the panel are Mike Lemonick, who you met earlier today, and Jen Schwartz. Both of them work at one of my favorite publications, Scientific American, and Professor Wang in the last panel alluded to the fact that Scientific American made an endorsement for president this year, so I'm curious if that will come up in the discussion. I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce the other panelists, and I'll be back for the Q&A. So without further ado, Mike and Jen.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to toggle back and forth between my notes and my screen, but let me introduce the panelists first, and then each of them is going to talk a bit about this issue from their own perspective, and then we hope there will be time for lots of questions, because the problem with this conference or this symposium is that each session could actually be a day-long symposium in itself. So we're only going to scratch the surface. Anyway, my co-chair for this session is my colleague, Jen Schwartz. She's a senior features editor at Scientific American. She produces stories on the intersection of technology and society, writes about how people are adapting or not to a rapidly changing world, especially when it comes to climate change and disinformation. So that's pretty relevant. She co-led our 2019 special issue on truth, lies, and uncertainty, and recently edited a November 2020, so this next month, but it's out already, special report on confronting misinformation. The other three panelists are Stephanie Anglin, an assistant professor of psychological science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. In her research, she studies how people reason about and communicate science. She's particularly interested in understanding how beliefs and motives influence scientific reasoning and communication among both lay people and scientists. And she also teaches a course on scientific integrity and communication, which focuses on teaching students to critically evaluate scientific evidence and claims. Matt Daniels is a journalist and the founder of The Pudding, a journal for visual essays that began in 2017. The Pudding has won numerous awards for its data and visual storytelling, including a Peabody Award for digital journalism, an Emmy nomination, and the recognition as the Data Journalism Site of the Year from the Data Journalism Awards. And finally, Katie Peak, whom I referred to in introducing our keynote speaker, a highly successful graduate of the SHERP program that Dan Fagan runs. She's a journalist and data visualization designer who specializes in print graphics for science magazines. She's a contributing artist at Scientific American and regularly creates pieces for Audubon and the New York Times. She has also illustrated several books. Dr. Peak was originally an astronomer. She has a PhD in astrophysics, but she has a degree in science journalism as well. And she's the former graphics editor for Popular Science magazine. So I'm not going to be a panelist myself. I have obviously experience and thoughts on all of these issues, but we don't have time to hear everybody. And I'm going to go for the more important panelists first. But I will just say that this is a question that we journalists face all the time, as has been alluded to earlier by a number of panelists. The one thing I think I need to emphasize is that, of course, we have a responsibility to present data and evidence and scientific results in the most honest way we can, but there is a competing need that we have, which is unfortunate but true. We need to convince readers to read what we're writing about. So if somebody is writing about a cure for cancer or a potential cure for cancer, it would be, in a sense, professional malpractice for us to lead with all of the caveats. Here are all the reasons why this might not be true. Okay, now that you're primed to be skeptical, here are the results. Because a piece like that would simply be very unlikely for anyone to read. And we need readers to stay in business. So we have an obligation to our institutions, our media institutions, to get people to read what we write or what we present. And the earlier panelists were talking about some of the difficulties in the portrayal of claims in the media. One of the reasons those difficulties come up is that if all we talk about is the uncertainty, which is a really, really, really important part of science, a crucial part of science, the average reader who has not been particularly well educated in science or doesn't remember their education from high school or middle school will say, you know, I don't want to hear about uncertainty. What's the answer? I want to know what the answer is. And in a way, the news business uses a very different framework from science, and we have a kind of a different set of values in that the word news implies that we are going to tell you about the newest thing, and that's how it works. A new study comes out in a reputable journal, that's news. That's the newest thing, and that's what we write about often. And the problem is that the newest results are often the least robust. Over the next months or years, people look at those results, try to replicate them, try to see if there are any issues with how they're presented, and what and so the truth, you know, in principle, we're talking about the truth, but the truth doesn't necessarily come out when the news comes out. Whereas, you know, if Trump says something ridiculous at a rally, that actually happened. You don't have to wait to analyze it. It happened, and so you report that it happened. When we do that, again, under the rubric of what we actually do in the news, we don't know if it actually happened. The paper was published, but what does it mean? We don't know yet. We often don't know yet, and it might take a long time before you know. So, with that caveat, let me go to our panelists, and I'm going to ask Stephanie Anglin to speak first. I hope she is ready, and since we always take more time than we want, I'd love it if you could keep your remarks to no more than 5-ish minutes. And if you can't, we will understand.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start off, and I guess I will be starting off from more of an academic approach. So I don't know, we'll see if some of the things I say are invalidated from what we can do from a journalist perspective. But I think it's kind of nice as some of the comments that I'm making sort of dovetail with the last session as well about how can we sort of increase public understanding of science and appropriate scientific skepticism. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I thought I would talk about, because I am a psychologist, the psychology side of science communication, focusing on a few of the challenges to science communication that I study: scientific uncertainty, motivated reasoning, and exaggeration. So Mike already started talking a little bit about scientific uncertainty, and maybe that's not what lay people want to hear, but uncertainty is inherent to science. We're continuously revising our theories and knowledge in light of new evidence, and conclusions are especially tentative for new theories and evidence. And scientific claims are even more tenuous, given that scientific evidence and scientific studies vary in quality. So I'll give you a few examples from the social and biomedical sciences. Researchers, for example, don't always replicate their studies, and when they do, they don't always replicate. Researchers sometimes rely on small convenient samples. and a limited set of stimuli and paradigms. They sometimes engage in selective reporting, only reporting those results consistent with their theory and not those inconsistent with their theory. And they sometimes misinterpret or exaggerate their findings. And so on the scientist side, we know science is uncertain, but as Mike said, lay people vary in their understanding of scientific uncertainty and how they respond to that. In fact, a recent series of studies showed that nearly half of lay people say we don't know more when a study fails to replicate, when of course we do, because we don't continue to believe that that finding always holds. And so one challenge, as sort of Mike brought up, is that how can we emphasize scientific uncertainty and the varying quality of scientific evidence? And can we do this without undermining public support for science? So it is challenging, but I don't think that support for science is incompatible with scientific skepticism. In fact, my collaborators and I have some preliminary data suggesting that although those who more strongly support science believe it is more certain, those with strong scientific reasoning skills believe science is less certain, more strongly critique individual studies, but more strongly support science overall. And so scientific skepticism doesn't have to equate to distrust of science, but it is those with stronger scientific reasoning skills and background that are able to distinguish. All right, so another challenge to science communication, which came up as well in the last panel, is motivated reasoning, which refers to information processing influenced by goals. Now, we typically think of motivated reasoning as influenced by directional goals, or the desire to reach a particular conclusion, but we can also be motivated to be accurate. Now, while we can be motivated to be accurate, the literature suggests that we don't always do this, that we sometimes evaluate studies consistent with our beliefs more favorably than those inconsistent with our beliefs, and that people more strongly support research on belief consistent versus belief inconsistent findings. That said, in a recent series of studies, I found when I presented people with a clear pattern of evidence challenging their views, they were receptive to the evidence and shifted their beliefs in response to it, suggesting that people may sometimes be receptive to evidence challenging their views, at least when the results are presented in a clear and consistent way. And so another question for science communication is, how can we promote accuracy versus directional goals when communicating findings, particularly polarized findings? And I think this is a question that we're struggling with, but we do have some preliminary evidence that needs to be examined further. It's quite encouraging, suggesting that encouraging deliberation and applying critical reasoning when evaluating evidence might reduce bias and help people respond to the evidence. All right, so the last challenge I'll focus on is exaggeration. And we commonly believe it's the media that sensationalizes research to attract public attention and interest. However, research has shown that more exaggeration occurs from journal article to press release than from press release to news article, suggesting that it's researchers and their institutions rather than journalists responsible for exaggeration. And aligning the press releases with the journal articles can reduce exaggeration in the news stories without reducing news uptake or the number of articles written on the research. Now, one question that sort of Mike alluded to is, well, does it reduce interest in those stories? And we need to investigate this further. We have some we predicted that it would, but we have some counterintuitive findings suggesting, at least in the context of a study, that it did not. That people rated accurate science news stories as equally, if not more interesting than attention-grabbing ones. Of course, this is in the context of a study, so perhaps in the real world it occurs differently. All right, so why then does exaggeration occur? Well, we may continue to believe that's what people want. Maybe that is what people want when they're searching on their newsfeed. In addition, science communicators sometimes fail to properly communicate the conclusions that should be drawn from the research, given the methods and findings. And even if they do properly communicate the conclusions that should be drawn, lay people don't always draw the correct conclusions because they lack a strong understanding of science. For example, they may fail to differentiate between correlation and causation, and they may not properly contextualize what the results mean given the strength of the findings. And so I'm going to sort of piggyback on the last panel to say that, well, the first step in reducing exaggeration is on scientists to promote credible science by giving consumers the information they need to evaluate evidence. It's especially important for scientists to be transparent about their methods and their findings when reporting their research. But of course, the other challenge is that we also need to increase public understanding of science so the public knows what to do with that information that we provide. Okay, so yeah, so some of the challenges to science communication, we can take steps to address them. For uncertain findings, we can properly communicate the amount and strength of evidence. To reduce motivated reasoning, we can encourage critical thinking. And for exaggeration, we really need to emphasize the conclusions that should be drawn. Now, ultimately, an important piece of the puzzle, which the last panel started talking about, is how can we increase public understanding of science and critical scientific reasoning skills. Okay, that's all I have to say. I look forward to the discussion.
Sorry, unmute, the slowest step in this Zoom world. Okay, so I'm going to ask Matt Daniels to speak next, followed by Katie Peak and Jen Schwartz. I hope that's amenable to everyone. Matt, please go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. As Mike mentioned, I work at a small visual journalism publication called The Pudding. Obviously, my thing is visualization. And that's really what I think I'll talk about for now, and I'll keep this short, no visuals, and just some of the key things that I keep in mind when it comes to communicating data. As I said, I'm all about visualization. And one of the things that's really sat with me is this idea from, I guess we'll call him an internet philosopher. His name's Brett Victor. And he has this concept called active readership. And I'll just read a quote of how he describes active readership. An active reader is someone who asks questions and considers alternatives and questions assumptions, and even questions the trustworthiness of the author. And an active reader doesn't passively sponge up information, but uses the author's argument as a springboard for critical thought and deep understanding. And he has a few examples of how he tries to bring this to life. A lot of it involves interactives and allowing you to like mouse over different ideas and explore where the author was coming from. A lot of this is probably impractical, but I think the core concept is really interesting to me. And I think about when I'm an active reader, when I'm absorbing anything on the internet or even reading a book. Sometimes when I'm deep in that long read, that 10,000 word New Yorker-esque article, it's hard for me to really consider how present I am with the author's argument. I sometimes feel like just a sponge soaking up all of the information and not really sitting and thinking about it. So that's why I think visualization is really interesting, because you do sometimes sit with a visual and think. And you're questioning your own assumptions, and you're questioning where the author was coming from, and even looking at sources. And a good, well done chart can really create active readership. So that's one concept that I sit with. The next one is called pattern languages, and this is based off of a book by an architect, Chris Alexander, and it's a pretty old book, and you can still find this process on the internet today. And what he does is he catalogs the different patterns that exist when it comes to building spaces for people. So a very simple example of this is the open kitchen that you might find in your home. This is a pattern that exists that creates community within your home. And this weird tension between living and cooking can exist. And it's an interesting pattern that you find. Another one is the bay window. Another one is just the idea of suburbs and downtowns. So really just these patterns that are interesting, that seem to be tried and true, that architects and urban designers can use when thinking about creating spaces. And I love that mental model because I use it when thinking about communicating ideas and visualization as well. What is the pattern language of communicating visually? specifically with data. And for a while, those patterns were pretty well defined. In papers and newspapers and magazines, we knew the charts to make. But with the internet and technology, I've been thinking a lot about the different patterns that can exist when there are infinite possibilities when it comes to animation and interactivity and scrolling and tapping and AR, who knows? But those patterns are something that's in the back of my head when I'm working on a project. And then lastly, Mike, you mentioned this, what happens when you are trying to present data and nobody is listening? There's this great video on the internet that y'all should look up called Painting in the Dark. It's on Vimeo and basically says that same premise of what does it mean when you're trying to communicate a concept or creating art and no one is watching. And I think about this a lot because it's very easy to fall into the trap of creating an idea or visualizing an idea and trying to communicate it and trying to force it to be widespread, create virality. And it's really easy to think, oh, I need to dress this up or I need to dumb it down to get the biggest audience possible. But when I'm trying to communicate a concept, I actually try to just pick one person that I want to reach. And it's a lot easier to write for an individual than it is to write for the internet. And then there's just two other subpoints I'll make, and then I'll be done, is that it's a lot easier to work on projects when I can empathize with what I don't know. So if I'm trying to communicate some idea driven by data, like perhaps around climate change, if I come from a place where I didn't know about that idea, it's a lot easier to write about it, because I know what it's like for the reader to be ignorant and naive when it comes to understanding that concept. So that sat with me. And then the last thing is this quote from Randall Munroe, who writes XKCD. And I heard it on a Vox podcast, but he says, don't overestimate the audience's intelligence and underestimate their knowledge. So that can come to life a lot when you're thinking about communicating data concepts is you do want to make sure that you assume they're highly intelligent people, but they just don't have the knowledge yet to understand what you're communicating. So this is, again, really helpful when you pick an individual rather than the entire internet. You can empathize with your uncle or your niece or someone that you have in mind who's highly intelligent, but just doesn't have the knowledge that you have. So anyway, that's kind of what was on my mind. And yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about it more in the panel.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. Especially the last couple of things you mentioned. I think that's something that's certainly something I try to instill in my students, my undergraduate students who mostly have no experience in journalism, and who need to be reminded that the reader or the viewer is intelligent and is interested, but does not have the background knowledge that you do, being immersed in the subject. And not just students, but the professional scientists who write opinion pieces for me at Scientific American haven't stopped to think about that. And I have to remind them often, you know, you're not talking to your peers, you're not giving a conference talk to other scientists like yourself. You're talking to people. Imagine yourself at a dinner party or something, and you're talking to intelligent, interested people who would not have a clue what you just said because you're using jargon that's not familiar. So that's a really, really important point that cannot be emphasized enough. Katie, we'd love to hear from you.
I think I'm unmuted now. Hi, I'm Katie Peak, and yeah, I freelance, create information graphics and data visualizations, and I also write. And I do a lot of work with Scientific American, which I'll speak about in a minute. But I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about my process for when I create a visualization, because I think, because I was originally trained as a scientist, and I have, and that just is like, it just means that scientific uncertainty is just fully baked into my process, like from beginning to end when I create something for the public. And actually the thing that was hardest for me to learn moving into journalism and doing the SHIRT program was that thing about nobody has to actually read what you've written. And so it has to be interesting and engaging. So I guess those are basically the two filters that I'm just running all the time when I'm looking for stories and creating pieces. Is it interesting to someone who doesn't know necessarily anything about it? And also, are the data sources that I'm going to choose to tell this story good data sources? Are they, I'm always visualizing when I'm looking for a data source to use for a story. I'm also thinking about how I'm going to portray that data visually. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm going to have a way to show the data that won't misrepresent it, either our certainty in it or the conclusions that it's drawing. So I guess what I wanted to say was that a lot of my work on the uncertainty in the data that I'm presenting comes from, just happens sort of behind the curtain with a lot of what I do. And I'm just going to make sure that I choose a way to portray it that that doesn't misrepresent the data. So I guess I thought I would just show a couple of pieces that I've done. I'm just going to do that thing where I show you my desktop and all of its messy glory. Sorry. But then I was thinking this way, I can really, mouse around maybe. Can you see my mouse, I think? So I actually picked 2 pieces to show, or 3 pieces to show that I'll do quickly. I may not get to all of them, but so I just went through a bunch of things that I've done in the past and looked at ways that I've portrayed uncertainty. And so here's a piece I did for the back page of Scientific American, which is always a graphic piece. And so, the piece has to have, this is about gravitational wave detections. And the idea was to show that these things are happening all over the universe. This is all the gravitational wave detections to date at the time that this was published, which was last year. And the thing about the gravitational wave detections is that they're actually not very well or accurately known. And so what I chose to do was to create one uncertainty bubble. Like you need like many detectors to be able to triangulate the actual pinpoint location. But the location actually wasn't super important to the story that I wanted to tell here, because I just wanted to show that they've happened at many distances and sort of all over the sky. That was my main point. And so I chose to do one uncertainty bubble here and then have text to sort of explain about the uncertainty. And so I guess the example that I've chosen this as an example because I felt like it gives a reader who's spending the time with it a sense of the uncertainty that's involved. And I'm also wanted to point out that I use captions very heavily in my pieces so that readers are drawing the conclusions that I want them to draw. The other pieces that I was going to speak about sort of make that same point. So I'll just mention this one where this was a piece I did for Audubon magazine, where we wanted to show connections between places in the West, between different, where birds migrate between different lakes. And we don't actually know the migration path, but we know that the connection exists. And so this was done for print, and so it would have appeared much bigger, and you could actually see all these lines that are very finely drawn. But we put a little caveat up here to show that these are not exact paths. Just that there are ways to be really explicit with the reader about what your uncertainties are when you choose how to display your data. So I guess that my 2 main points were that I'm gonna try to choose a way to display data that doesn't misrepresent anything. That's the first step. And then the second step is to be totally explicit about where the uncertainties are in as much as you can visually.
You seem to be done.
I seem to be done.
Okay,
I'll mute myself.
for the moment. Jen, you are up.
Hi, thanks. Like Katie, I will also just talk about process mostly as a journalist, and I also am not a scientist, so that I suppose makes me a little different in this group. I do not have an academic science background. I grew up with scientific parents, and that's about it. So my approach to science journalism and working at Scientific American comes from that place that somebody else mentioned. I'm an educated, curious person, but I don't know anything really about a lot of the topics that I'm covering, or I might know the basics, but I have to approach every story, whether I'm writing it, editing it, shaping something, as our reader. Many of our readers are not scientists, but they are very curious, educated people. So I approach everything from that perspective, and I come from a fact-checking background initially, and not just checking proper nouns, spellings, is this thing true, but it really taught me how to think, not just the critical thinking, but how do you start to look for what might be missing? How do you see what is not there? What context has been potentially warped? What sort of bias might be there that is not necessarily clear? And so doing that for several years in journalism, we call it fact checker brain. It's like you look at everything with a lens of skepticism and questioning and poking at things, which can be sometimes taken to too much of an extreme. But I think it informs how I approach a lot of my work as a journalist, and is a sort of other pathway to bringing this level of skepticism and managing uncertainty that is different from the typical scientific training. I'm just going to note, since it's come up a couple of times with the endorsement, the presidential endorsement at Scientific American, that, from my perspective, and again, as someone who's not a scientist, science has always been political. And I think the more that, we scientists and people in those positions sort of ignore that or try to distance themselves from that, the more it can create the level of distrust in the public and prevent us from doing a better job, in scientific institutions, from gaining public trust. And I think that's important because for the magazine's 175th anniversary, which we just had, I worked with a colleague on an essay that we called Reckoning with Our Mistakes. And we looked back at our 175-year history, looking at how Scientific American has perpetuated a lot of politically motivated or biased science. And that includes things like scientific racism, eugenics, going back really far in our archives. You look at how even themes of manifest destiny and editorials that sort of basically say, like, Native Americans should be wiped out because we have to build railroads and we have nothing to learn from these people. And I looked at the legacy of that today, which is that, my gosh, now you look at, these UN climate adaptation reports that are saying we have to look to indigenous knowledge worldwide to understand how to live in better relationship to the land and create more sustainable systems, because a lot of what we're doing doesn't work. And I just look at that and think, what if we, as a science magazine, and what if we actually acknowledged the mistakes of the past and who was excluded, and recognized that science is a lot more, political and motivated, and how these things creep in. And if we don't do that work now, we actually are not going to gain the trust of the people that we've hurt or left out and not included at the table. So I'll just quickly talk about some of my recent work as it pertains to this theme. I came to working on misinformation, disinformation through the lens of climate change initially, of how we are adapting to it, and how you take these very complex and these complex topics and a lot of uncertainty, and how you tell a story around it that makes people recognize where they can start to evaluate their own lives and their own communities and the effects of what's happening in a more personal way that relates to them. But more recently, in the past year and a half or so, I've done a lot of work in misinformation. So as Mike said, I co-led our 2019 special issue, Truth, Lies, and Uncertainty, which really looked at, the network spread of misinformation, the neuroscience of perception, the history of propaganda, digital disinformation, platforms, amplification. And then more recently, in our November 2020 issue, and my boss, my editor, Seth Fletcher, had said to me a few months ago over the summer, how can we do something around the election that gets at this like collective mental breakdown that we've all been having? So my approach in the past year and with the pandemic and the election and just massive disinformation is really looking at processing the anguish that a lot of us feel. And something that hasn't really been discussed too much yet today is we are all overwhelmed and exhausted and by the noise. And so I see it, part of my role as an editor and a writer is not to always deal in these abstractions and the research and, looking at the, quantitative analysis of bot farms but really thinking about how this affects us and what the takeaways should be so that we can find a sense of peace. Because ultimately, we have all these discussions about truth versus lies, facts versus falsehoods, but what we're dealing with right now is a crisis of not having shared reality and not having stability. And so I think about it through that lens. How do we get people to see these problems in a more, in a way that affects them personally and that they can really relate to, and what they can take away from it so that they can go into next week, for example, feeling a little bit more prepared to deal with the onslaught of noise that might occur.
Thanks, Jen. You've all made me think quite a bit, and Catherine is going to be ready, I believe, to get us some questions from the audience. But I wanted to ask, to reinforce something Jen just said. We also, for our 175th anniversary issue, actually laid out some of these things we got very wrong, including the kinds of things Jen talked about. And one thing that is very different now from when I began my career in the early 80s is that science journalists are now, only relatively recently, stepping back and looking at the whole enterprise of science and how it is not just political, but how it is embedded in the culture in ways that basically misrepresent the history of science. So we tell these grand narratives about how a few white men inevitably created modern science and improved the world and our knowledge of the world in so many different ways. And there's so many stories we have left out, we collectively have left out in doing that, and so many contributors to the enterprise of science that we've left out simply because for a long time, forever until quite recently, it has simply been assumed that the story that you heard growing up is the story, and that the people you heard about, the famous names you've heard about, are the people who made it all happen, and that the reason that most of the senior researchers, it's less and less true now, but for most of my career, the people who are making great discoveries have been men, is because men are somehow better at science or something, or women are just not interested. And all of these implied, all these assumptions that we have made in doing our jobs, we just accepted, or at least I did when I was first coming up, and only now are we beginning to look at the entire enterprise of science as something that we haven't been truthful about. So I just wanted to, I'm not sure where that fits in, but it's something that struck me. I also wanted to ask, to say in reaction to what Stephanie said, that it comes as a surprise when I hear you say that people are interested in more technical, I don't know if you use the word more technical. They're not interested in exciting stories. They want sort of hard facts and details and so on. As you say, it was done in a study, so maybe that doesn't reflect the real world. But as I'm sure you know, editors out here in the real world who have more of a foot in that world than in the academic world are absolutely convinced that we have to hook people and we have to convince them to read our stories. So I don't know what the truth is there. I had a colleague once who just could not get over the fact that the Los Angeles Times wouldn't put stories about particle physics on the front page every day or every week, because everybody's interested in particle physics, and the editors are just stupid, because if they only, I mean, literally she said that, if only they would put these hardcore science stories on the front page, they'd sell way more papers. And I thought it was ridiculous. Maybe it's not ridiculous. Finally, I was going to ask Matt if you can give an example or two. I know you didn't want to show any specific stories, but of a story that you, I use the word story loosely, that you did, that did try to convey something not necessarily what people were clamoring for, but what people became interested in when you wrote to that one person and tried to explain to that intelligent but not expert person out there.
Yeah, just briefly, one such project I think was on population density and population growth, which, as I mentioned before, I really had no background on, kind of stumbled across just doing my own thing, and spent a lot of time thinking about how to bring this to life in a way that would intrigue a layperson. And ended up doing some interactive animating 3D visualizations of population around the world, both historically, I think the data went back to 1970, and also projecting out to 2050 and showing what the world will be like in 40 years when it comes to where humans congregate. And by focusing on that one person and saying, oh, I think they'll really grok this approach rather than just making a bunch of tables of data or traditional charts, they might be able to lean into the idea a bit more. So that's one such thing. And again, not the most exciting topic in the world, but, and I think on its face pretty dry for most people, but figuring out a way to bring it to life where they would lean in and explore the information themselves.
Okay, interesting. Catherine, do we have, I should ask the other panelists if they have questions for each other.
I guess I had a question. I was really encouraged to hear from the journalist's perspective about communicating science, that you were really writing for an intelligence article and to communicate the uncertainty and all those things. And I guess I was just wondering, because I know there's a variety of ways in which science journalism occurs. And I think that, Scientific American might be more trustworthy than other sources. And so I was wondering, like, do you think that the majority of science journalists sort of approach it that way, writing for an intelligent audience to communicate the uncertainty and so forth?
Jen, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I should have given the caveat that I'm really lucky to work, I'm a features editor. I work on a monthly schedule, right? I'm producing sort of long 3,000 to 6,000 word stories and big graphics that are definitely more, in many cases, they're not very newsy. I mean, they're relevant and timely, but they're not tied to, like, we're not reacting to the news. So my approach is far more sort of analytical and reflective and asking big questions and trying to connect dots for people. So it's not ever really based on, one study that has come out, which has its problems, reporting on, a single study. But I think that everyone's doing the best they can in journalism. But for sure, I'm very glad, for example, that I am not a breaking news reporter who has to be participating in covering this election. I've done a lot of research on what it means to be part of a newsroom covering this election, and the amount of not just misinformation, but just intentional efforts to deceive, to distract. The way that you have to operate in an environment where there is so much media manipulation is incredibly intense. And then you couple that with, budgets being slashed, all sorts of forces that make it incredibly difficult to do your work as a journalist. So I'm very lucky in that I get to work in the realm of deep thinking and long periods of reporting and editing and multiple people's hands shaping things. So that's where I'm coming from, but there's absolutely, there are all sorts of variables that make it very difficult to report and write well, even when, in that sort of daily or more reactionary sense.
Can I jump in with one of the questions that was asked by a participant in their registration? So they asked about fake news and how do we eradicate fake news? And Jen, I think to your point about you not being in the political newsroom, I'm wondering if all of the panelists have been impacted by this idea of fake news and how you push back on that.
I'll start by bringing a message from one of the leading disinformation researchers, Claire Wardell, who is at First Draft. If any of you, you should absolutely check it out. They're doing incredible work around election stuff and pandemic, and have been doing stuff for years. But she does not like the term fake news, and a lot of researchers in that space do not either, because it's kind of a term that was absolutely co-opted by Donald Trump and others, and it's used in this both sides way. And so I like to think of this more as, Claire Wardell calls it information disorder. Another scholar who just wrote for Scientific American, Joan Donovan at Harvard, calls it media manipulation. We look at misinformation maybe as the umbrella term of false ideas spreading, disinformation being intentionally false. So I think about it more broadly like that, of this is not just about a fake news article or these people are putting out propaganda and these people are the truth. I think it's a much bigger issue of how we think about our role as journalists, how we might write a headline. We're having this discussion in this group where we're talking about, is something compelling, how are people going to read it versus what is sensational? But you might need to write a grabby headline that's going to go into a news feed versus what is the actual content of the article. And is it, that's a strategy that we're all working on. And because we have to, because this is the world of platforms and, the economy of attention that we live in. But I think that it's a broader issue that if we think about it just in the context of fake news and fake ideas versus real and, truth versus lies, we actually, it prevents us from really grappling with the bigger issues, I think.
And I just wanted to dovetail on Jen's point a little bit to just make explicit how much the social algorithms are a part of what we're all fighting here, and that it's not I feel like there's journalists doing their best, and then there's what people actually see, and that we're all learning to adjust what we do in response to these algorithms that are, I have no answers on that. Again, very lucky to work in print on a very measured time scale. And that just feels like a really hard thing that we're all up against.
And it's something that it's something that has gotten much worse and has accelerated with the internet. But when I started my career, there was no internet, or there was no web. There were no web-based publications, and even then, we were wrestling with these issues. I had a conversation with my editor at Time magazine, probably in the early 90s. A new study had come out, some kind of brain imaging study that showed that, I can't even remember what it was, some nutrient might be preventive against Alzheimer's disease. And so the first question is, do we run the story? And the answer was, yes, everyone else is running the story. And if we don't, people will wonder, what's the matter with us? Why aren't we covering this thing that is important? So that was one element of the decision. Then the question is how to discover it. And the way that one would cover something like that is with the headline says, new study shows that eating more, grapes may be preventive against Alzheimer's. And you go, which is a bit grabby, and then you go into the actual study and how they did it and the caveats and all that stuff. But I said to my editor, just as a thought experiment, look, why don't we present this in the most honest way possible? Let us do a headline that says, new study almost certainly does not prove that eating more grapes will prevent Alzheimer's. And then we could go on to say, well, it's a correlation. But he said, are you insane? You can't have a headline like that. Nobody's going to read that story. And of course I was kidding, because I knew we couldn't have a headline like that. So, in this course I teach in the spring on science and the media, we talk about some of these pressures that journalists are under, because I'm still convinced that you have to grab readers' attention to get them to read the stories, and that you have to make something seem as important as you possibly can without crossing the line into hype or misrepresentation. And it is true, in this study, I'm not actually remembering correctly, that eating more grapes could help prevent Alzheimer's. So if it's true, even if it's misleading, well, and those are the trade-offs that we go through. Katie looks like she wants to talk. No, your box lit up. Okay. Jen.
I just wanted to, Katie's point about the algorithms. What's different, people will often, when we're having this discussion about information disorder, fake news, people will say, well, this problem has always existed, and it has, of course, but today we're existing where so many people get their information. We're not talking news here, we're talking information from social platforms. And the way that they're incentivized to spread novelty and target your emotions. And so by design, what goes viral or what spreads, what people amplify, are things that make us feel outraged or scared or deeply impassioned, or we really align with it. And that is not ever really how science is communicated. It is not targeting people's emotions. It's not meant to scare them. So I'm curious too, even about Stephanie's research in terms of, I think a lot of people are actually interested in learning and want to know. And if you're giving people examples side by side and saying, and asking them, do you still care about this thing, even though it might not be as exciting? I think that's very different from the environment in which people sort of find themselves day in and day out on phone screens, scrolling through things, sort of half paying attention. And they're there not necessarily to glean information, but to entertain themselves. Mm-hmm. And we're so used to this sort of doom scrolling that you're not tuned into the content the way that you would be if you were, opening up a newspaper. So I think it's that's part of the challenge of what we do is scientists and journalists and communicators of evidence-based knowledge, is that we can't use the same tools as disinformation agents and influence operators and propagandists who operate on these platforms, because it would, by its very design, that would invalidate our integrity. So it's not necessarily about using those same methods, because that's not who we are, that's not what we do. And we have to see that the design of a lot of these platforms and the algorithms that drive them are not made to elevate and to amplify truth, which is often far less, it's a little more boring than novelty.
Yeah, I would just like to jump in to say that I think you're absolutely right. I think that the context matters. I think that people who sign up to participate in a scientific study and are in the context of participating in a study are very different than people scrolling through the social media. And I think absolutely more of a field-based study would be more, generalizable. And in fact, when I've told my students about these findings, they're like, yeah, that's great. Like, I'll read something critically for this class, but when I go out, and I'm on like my social media platforms, I'm just clicking on the headlines that I find interesting. And so I think there is an important distinction there.
But I think it's promising, like your research shows that people like scientists and journalists can be like, oh, why is the public so stupid? Why are people skeptical of a coronavirus vaccine? And I think your research shows that people do care and people do want to seek out truthful knowledge. They want to learn. But the design of our information environment does not incentivize that. So we had to remember as journalists and scientists that we're not, it's not like, oh, the public is just dumb. They're so anti-science, they don't get it. And think more creatively and bringing people in and, having just more compassion for, my mom will watch Fox News when there's a big news event because she wants to see what the other side is saying and communicating. And I think if we did more of that, of realizing how much money and effort goes into confusing people, we would have more sort of compassion and desire to help have more consensus, as opposed to just saying we need to throw more facts at people, and if they just believed science they would get it. But it is absolutely not that simple. And I think your work shows that there's a lot more room to include people, rather than just writing them off.
So we have about 2 minutes left, but you sort of touched on, I think, the last question, which is a question from one of our audience members about what skills for understanding science do you guys see as most critical and most lacking in science consumers? And Jen, I think you just basically said you reject the premise of that question because it's not necessarily that the science consumers are not intelligent, and that we shouldn't assume that. But for people who are interested in being careful consumers of news, do you guys have any quick pieces of advice, or for educators who are helping kids learn those skills, do you have any quick pieces of advice for them?
I'll go quickly and then let the others speak. I do not reject the premise of that question. I think it's an excellent question. I'm going to go back to something Dan Fagan said in the beginning. That is my whole MO right now, is we have to help people make peace with uncertainty. We are in a rapidly changing world, and the pandemic will not be the last of it. Climate change is going to be bringing us all sorts of uncertainty and disruption. And I think we talk about people need more civics education. They need more media literacy, more critical thinking. All of that can be true, but I think my own opinion, having done the work that I've done, is we need to help everyone get more comfortable with making decisions in a time of great and growing uncertainty. So I'll just put that out there and let the others speak.
This was a question towards the science consumer, right? Not the writers. Sorry.
Well, I think it's a question about, in your experience as communicators, where do you see miscommunication from the other side happening, or they're not understanding what you're trying to communicate? You guys talked a lot about your own process of trying to be good communicators, but from that other side, are there things that people can do to educate themselves to be better consumers?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that stood out to me, as the other panelists have mentioned, like uncertainty or skepticism of some of the things you're reading. I think one thing that stood out to me that I saw recently was how the literacy of reading a scientific paper and how it's very easy to get to attached to a headline. There's a lot of that happening right now with mask efficacy and one's ability to read a paper and understand what it's suggesting, what its own skepticism of its own findings are, seems to be a huge area for improvement, I guess. But on that point, one thing that I saw that was interesting was that even the science writers themselves, even the academics, are writing these papers in a style that is meant for academia. And one person had pointed out how interesting it was where they'd get this paper from an academic, and a journalist would get this paper from an academic, they'd read it, and they'd have no idea what they were talking about. But then they'd find the author of this paper just chatting with a journalist or writing something to a layperson. They were just this marvelous writer who could communicate the concept on such a better level. There's something with the academic papers which dumbs down the communication to such a level that lay people can't grok anything that they're understanding or anything that they're communicating. So I think it's twofold. One, on the reader side of just how do you read a paper and not jump to conclusions? And then on the other side, how do we make those papers more consumable to the layperson?
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank all of the panelists for such great thoughts. And I invite the audience to continue the discussion in the Q&A. We are going to take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 12:30 for a musical performance and Q&A from our colleague and wonderful artist, Wardell. So we encourage everyone to come back then and for the rest of the day. So thank you, everyone, and more soon.